Hi, and welcome to the AI table. Today, we have an awesome guest with us, Reed Blackman. Reed, you want to do a quick introduction of yourself?
Sure, I'm Reed Blackman. I wrote a book called The Ethical Nightmare Challenge recently. Before that, I wrote a book called Ethical Machines. And I'm the founder and CEO of Virtue, which is historically a boutique consultancy that helps organizations avoid the bad stuff of AI. I'm a philosopher and more specifically an ethicist by training.
Yeah, that is an important point. So let's go ahead and dig right in. First up, the Ethical Nightmare Challenge. That is a very provocative title. Can you tell us a little bit about what inspires you to write the book?
I actually thought of the title, or I thought of the phrase "The Ethical Nightmare Challenge" years ago, but I didn't know what it was. Like I didn't know any details about it. I didn't know what the book was about, but I thought, oh, this is a good title for a book. It actually came up in an article that I was writing. I sort of spontaneously started calling this thing the Ethical Nightmare Challenge. What inspired me to write the book, I would say that there are two kinds of catalysts, both of which sort of come out explicitly in the book. The first is that I've seen where or how AI has developed and how it's developing. So in particular, the way that AI has evolved from narrow AI to generative AI to agentic AI to ultimately multi-agentic AI. And when you take a look at that landscape, that evolution of AI, what you see is that the risk landscape is getting crazy. It's getting diabolically complex. And my first book doesn't cover that kind of complexity. My first book came out in 22 before ChatGPT came out. So it didn't cover that kind of complexity. I don't think people are prepared or organizations are prepared for that level of AI complexity, that risk landscape. So that's one major catalyst to writing the book. The second had to do with a certain level of frustration that I've had working with large organizations for the past 8 years. So I started the business about 8 years ago. I work primarily with Fortune 500 organizations. My team and I have met with success and we've met with failure and everything in between because it's very hard, it turns out, to engage in the kind of organizational change that's required by building an enterprise-wide AI governance program. Different organizations hit different walls for different reasons, but what I decided, to sort of cut to the chase here, is that the way that we've been doing whatever you want to call it, AI ethics, responsible AI governance, and not just, when I say we, I mean me, my colleagues, my competitors, the big four. That standard approach is too slow for the technology. There's a variety of problems, but the main one is that it's too slow. By the time you pass a policy and try to implement it across the organization, the technology has moved on and now you're implementing a stale policy. You've got to update the policy, et cetera. This way is not good enough. We need something better. So between seeing that the standard approach is really broken and seeing the level of complexity of the AI risk landscape that's coming our way and it's actually here now, yada, 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 time to write a book.
Can you talk a little bit more about the risk landscape and how it's changed and become more risky in your view?
One is that there's just so many more points of failure. So when we were doing narrow AI, so the AI, the kind of, I know that you know this, but just for the audience to make sure, the kind of AI that, tells you whether a bone is broken in an X-ray image, that scores a resume, recognizes faces and photos, the AI lifecycle was relatively clear. There's the idea, the concept phase and design and build and test and validate, deploy, monitor. And that got complicated when it came to generative AI because all of a sudden, well, two things. Number one, there's the foundation model company, like an OpenAI or an Anthropic or Google, that builds that base level model. And then an organization like a Fortune 500 company takes it and modifies it in various ways. If they've got the money, they can do fine tuning, RAG, adapters, blah, blah, blah. So there's all sorts of things that they can do in order to sort of make it special, customized to their organization. And then there's all the different ways that people prompt a generative AI, all the different people prompting AI in all the different ways across all these different roles and all these different contexts. So that's a lot of points of failure. There's all the decisions that the foundation model companies make. There's the decisions that the internal data scientists at an organization make as they modify that foundation model. And then there's all the decisions by all those people who are prompting it in all those ways. So that's lots of places where there can be, if you like, an ethical, reputational, or legal error. And then you come to agentic AI. And as I think about agentic AI, that's essentially an AI, and at least currently, more specifically, an LLM that's connected to lots of different digital tools. So the internet, databases, other pieces of enterprise software like CRMs, other AIs, whether they're narrow or generative, or even if they're agents. All those points, all those things which it's connected, all those nodes of interaction, those are each points of failure, points at which you can start getting various kinds of, let's say, biases, hallucinations, privacy violations, that sort of thing.
Can you dig a little deeper for us and give some specific examples of what that failure looks like in real life for companies?
So when it comes to generative AI, or maybe mildly agentic, depending on what they did, we've seen a bunch of people, a bunch of large organizations in the news recently. So in October of 25 was in the news because they were commissioned to do a report for the Australian government, and they did that report, and it contained AI hallucinated information. Obviously, there was an issue about payment. There was in the headlines. They did that again. A different number firm within did that again a month later in November of 25 for the Canadian government this time. There was a law firm, I forgot the name of it, but one of the bigger law firms recently submitted a legal brief to a judge that contained AI hallucinated information. And so those are sort of easy, obvious places. You've got various companies getting sued for potentially biased or discriminatory algorithms. HR company that does software for hiring, they were in the news recently, or they're being sued. So those are some recent examples. What we haven't seen yet in the news, to my knowledge, is really full-blown agentic AI, except within organizations. And that's just because there's a variety of explanations, but I think one explanation is people don't know how to actually create AI agents in a way that is governable. And so they're just not doing it at the scale at which they claim they are.
So my next question is, you've warned that standard AI governance is inadequate. What's the most glaring example you've encountered where traditional responsible AI frameworks failed, and why did it fail?
So the standard approach is you start with something like an AI ethics or responsible AI or trustworthy AI statement. It contains your values or your principles or your pillars, where for fairness and privacy and transparency and accountability. And sometimes those principles just sort of float there and don't do anything. Usually they work their way into the sort of responsible AI program in two ways. Number one, they work their way into a policy, an enterprise-wide policy. And number two, that policy either contains or entails a set of procedures that are associated with each one of those values or principles. So for instance, we're for fairness, and so we're going to check for bias throughout the AI lifecycle. We're for transparency, and so we'll tell people whenever they're interacting with an AI. And now, once you've done that, now you have to start translating and implementing that policy across the organization, which in a large organization means hundreds of markets, several continents, dozens of countries, that sort of thing. And as I said earlier, when we did this with Fortune 500 CPG company, they were really fast. They were the people that we worked with there were really smart and made quick decisions. They were quick to understand what was at issue. They made good decisions. We eventually passed, or they passed with our help, an enterprise-wide AI policy, and it was a very robust policy. We were very pleased. Except the catch is that that policy was ultimately passed by the board of directors 9 months after we first started engaging with them. And that's because we could draft the policy in literally a matter of days, but then you need this person and that person and that person. You have all these different stakeholders who are weighing in, and the language is getting tweaked, and the lawyers get involved, and it's got to make its way to the board. It's got to get on the board's agenda. The board has to discuss it. So 9 months was fast. So anyway, then as there always is with projects, there's some kind of lag between the policy is passed. Now we have to implement. Okay, but couple of months of making sure that we're on board what the implementation plan looks like, blah, 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 blah. And then 5 months into implementing, agentic AI becomes a thing. Oh my God. Now we have a policy that doesn't include agentic AI. We are implementing a policy that is now stale, and we got to start this whole process all over again. And this is just it's a never-ending mess. Like you're never gonna solve that problem. And again, this was one example that stands in for many. And this was sort of the best case. This is when it only took 9 months to pass the policy, as opposed to year and a half.
So with that, what are your recommendations? How do companies get around this?
Well, I can give you the sort of read neutral answer and the read specific answer. So the read neutral answer is whatever else you do, whatever this other approach looks like, it has to have a couple of features. One is that it has to be rapidly implementable and scalable. Because if it takes you a long time to design it, if we're talking about like a year-long design phase and months and years-long implementation phases, you've lost the game. You've already lost, because the technology is moving too fast. And not only is it the technology of AI moving too fast, but other technologies are moving so fast. So we have blockchain and financial services. We might get fault-tolerant quantum computers in the not-too-distant future. I don't know what else we're going to get, but there's all this kind of technology that's always coming out, and it's interacting with each other. And so whatever else you think, you should think that we need a rapidly implementable and scalable approach. That's one thing that we should think about. The other thing which we didn't talk about is that the policy contains these procedures, right? We talked about translating the values to procedures, which turns this into a compliance effort, a procedural compliance effort. So, if you say, okay, for fairness, we're going to check for bias at each stage of the AI lifecycle, that sort of thing. We're going to look for potentially discriminating against stakeholders. So you do that sort of thing. And then you ask people, so did you achieve the fair outcomes? And all they can say is, well, I mean, what do you mean? We did the procedures. And I want to say, yeah, I know you did the procedures, but the procedures bring about the desired result of fairness. And the only thing they can say is, I don't know, we did the things. Like, you told us to do these procedures, so we did the procedures. The problem is that in translating those values or principles into procedures, defining them as a set of procedures, you've lost your way of independently assessing those procedures as being good or bad. Because usually we assess procedures by being good or bad by reference to whether or not they bring about the desired results. If the procedures bring about the desired results, good procedures. If they can't bring about the desired results, bad procedures. You need to change them. But because there's no specific outcome that we're trying to achieve, no articulated outcome with those procedures, we have no way of assessing whether those procedures are actually effective or efficient in bringing about what the outcomes are. So that leads me to the other, I think, sort of read neutral point, which is we need an approach that's outcome oriented. We need to know what success and what failure looks like. And if we don't, then we don't know what kinds of procedures are the appropriate ones to introduce. Okay, so that's sort of the read neutral stuff. Now, for the more read specific stuff, that's when we come to the ethical nightmare challenge. So the ethical nightmare challenge, there's a bunch of things to say here, obviously. In fact, it's a whole book of things to say.
Really important information here. But before you go down that path, I wanted
Yeah.
to piggyback on something you just spoke about
Mm.
because I noticed that as well. We're in this space where there's very heavy emphasis on the input and not the output. It's just a check a box. We did this. We're done. And there's not a follow through to circle back and say, did we produce what we wanted to produce?
Yeah.
Or some companies aren't even articulating what they want to produce. What they want
they
to
have no idea.
produce is
Yeah.
just the input that they did it, How do we move that forward?
So there's a couple things to say here. Actually, before I forget, one of the things, the other thing about that's wrong with these procedures is in the world of the agentic AI, where you have these LLMs connected to all these different tools, one thing that's really crucial is the context sensitivity of agents. Who's using the agent? How, what tools is it connected to? How does it use those tools? In what contexts? For what purposes? It's very context specific. And the problem with these sort of procedures that are laid down in policy that are, they're not sufficiently sensitive to context. So what you wind up with is a set of sort of 20, let's just call it 20 procedures, 20 controls, whatever you want to call them. And what you'll find is that 10 of them are appropriate and they make sense for this particular agent. 10 of them don't make any sense. They're not relevant. And there's another 10 that's not on the list that really should be there for this particular agent. So we can't create these generic procedures and apply them to all agents because the dangers of the agents, the ways in which they can go sideways, are very context specific. So that's another problem with the procedural approach. Now, in terms of outcomes, I think that what we did wrong is, and I say we because I said this in my first book, so I think I include myself in what we did wrong. What we did wrong is we focused on these values and said, look, yeah, we should be focusing on what the good is. We should be focusing on what is fair and transparent and accountable and privacy respecting, et cetera, et cetera. So in this book, I sort of flip that on its head and I say, no, actually what we should be paying attention to are the nightmares. Let's figure out what the really bad situations are, ethically, reputationally, legally, etc. And what I like about nightmares, among many things, is that nightmares are articulations of bad outcomes. Right? If you tell me what a nightmare scenario, you're telling me a situation, an outcome where things have gone bad. Things are bad. And you can also probably tell me in that nightmare how that bad thing came to be. And that means we can orient ourselves around the nightmare. So as I say in the book, just like a sort of regular old nightmare, I'm driving around in a car in, mountain, cliffside, beautiful, whatever. I'm with my family. My wife is in the car. My 2 kids are in the back seat. And I'm driving really fast around these curvy roads in the mountains of Italy, let's say. And before I know it, I missed a curve and we go flying off the cliff and my family is plummeting to its death and I don't feel so great. Okay, so that's literally a nightmare I've had. Okay, but one, aside that from there being a very definite outcome that I've specified, the death of my loved ones and myself, there's also, if you like, a little story about how that happened. It happened because I was driving too fast in twisty, curvy roads on the mountainside. So how do I not reach that outcome? Don't drive so damn fast on twisty, turny roads, right? So the nightmare specifies an outcome, and it also gives you some insight into how to avoid that nightmare, because usually you can specify how that nightmare came to be. And then you can think about, how do I block off the paths to that nightmare? So put it slightly differently, if we focus on identifying where the icebergs are, we can figure out how to steer around them, steer away from them. And I think it's the same thing with ethical, reputational, and legal risks of AI. With AI governance, we should start with outcomes that we want to avoid, and success is avoiding those outcomes. If you can deploy, let's say, an AI agent and not run into any of those outcomes that you've articulated, those really bad ones, that's success.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. In terms of engaging corporations on this material, what roles do you think are most important in terms of hearing this message and really understanding deeply what you're talking about in the book?
I mean, it used to be that, so this actually relates to a sort of another, I think, read neutral lesson. The way that the standard approach works is that it usually starts, and it can only start at one place in the organization. It typically only starts somewhere in the C-suite on the tech side of the house. Chief information officer, chief analytics officer, chief data officer, chief information security officer, that sort of thing. It very rarely starts anywhere else, except in a handful of cases they might already have someone who's got a title like global chair responsible AI, in which case that starts there. The problem is that it could, that's a sort of source of bottleneck. That means that everything has to start there. What would be much better is if you had an approach that can get started anywhere in the organization. So if, for instance, there's only a handful of people working on AI agents in the organization, then the governance should start there. You should start, if you like, at that AI agent project level. If there's a department, let's say it's innovation, or maybe it's HR, or maybe it's marketing, where they're doing a lot of AI work, okay, start the governance there. Maybe you don't need this enterprise-wide thing first. So when you ask me, which role, I kind of want to say, well, there's not the role. We shouldn't sort of, if you like, judge this in advance. We should think about it in terms of, for every organization, there are particular hotspots. There are particular places where they really need something like an AI governance practice. And that's where we start, whatever their roles are. So if it's CHRO, fine. If it's head of marketing, fine. If it's, these project leaders, these 3-4 project leaders in the innovation center who are doing AI agent stuff, then start there.
Thank you for that. And I know you've touched on your read neutral points, but let's hear your read specific ones.
Yeah. Okay. So the read specific stuff is the framework that is the ethical nightmare challenge. So I'll say at least two things here, because I think there's sort of two core parts of the solution. Okay. And the reason this is read specific is that this is my instantiation. This is my way of meeting those criteria of being rapidly implementable and scalable, outcome oriented, that sort of thing. There may be other ways. I don't know of any other ways. Mine is the only one that I know of, but I just want to acknowledge that in principle, there could be other ways of meeting those criteria. So my way is by way of the ethical nightmare challenge. That framework has 3 core questions. What are your organization's AI ethical nightmares? What resources will you build to avoid those nightmares? And how will you train your people to use those resources effectively? So those are the 3 questions. What are the nightmares? What resources to avoid them? What training to use those resources effectively? One thing that I really like about these 3 questions is that they're highly portable. In that, you can ask those 3 questions at any level of the organization. So for instance, if at the project level, you can say, for this particular AI solution, what are the ethical, reputational, and legal nightmares that we need to avoid? What resources do we have for avoiding them? And what training do we or our end users need in order to avoid those nightmares? At the department level, you can ask the same question. So let's say it's marketing or HR. What are the AI ethical, reputational, legal nightmares for HR? What resources does HR have to avoid them? How do we need to train HR personnel to use those resources? And finally, you can ask it at the enterprise level. So what are as the organization as a whole, what are our AI ethical, reputational, legal nightmares? What resources do we have? What training do we need to provide, et cetera? So they're highly portable. That's the first part of the solution. It's these highly portable 3 questions. Those 3 questions are also very simple. Everybody understands the language of nightmares. Because we're focused on nightmares, this is automatically an approach that is outcome oriented. It's where the outcomes are the things that we want to avoid, the nightmares. And if all 3 of those if all those levels of an organization are asking those same 3 questions, that does a lot to increase communication collaboration, which we desperately need. That's sort of, if you feel like, the first bucket. Second bucket, or second part of the solution, is what I call ethical nightmare challenge or ENC teams. So an ENC team is a cross-functional team, and it can exist at any level of the organization. You could have project-level ENC teams, so you create project-level ENC teams where appropriate. Department-level ENC teams, again, wherever there's lots of AI going on in the department, create that department-level ENC team. And then finally, there's the enterprise ENC team. Crucially, the mission of each ENC team is to answer the 3 questions. What are the nightmares? What are the resources? What's the training? And so you have a team of cross-functional people at the project level who are tasked with answering those 3 questions at the department level, at the enterprise level. These teams can be trained up literally in a matter of weeks. So the way that we work with our clients now is there is foundational level ENC training, which is just the basics of what's AI, what are the risks or nightmares baked into AI, and what's a simple way of thinking about them? That's 3 questions. And then there's ENC team leader training, which also delivered asynchronously. And that takes, again, we're talking about 1 to 2 weeks. And that means you can get an ENC team up and running. We do pilots in the course of 10 weeks. And what they're doing across those 10 weeks is they're forming the ENC teams. They're doing that asynchronous training. And this is one more crucial thing. If you throw a bunch of cross-functional experts into a room and say, solve the problem, they can't do that. So they need a method. They need steps. So there's a 7-step ENC method that the ENC team leader is trained on. And they have a worksheet where they're answering things like, what are the nightmares? What's the pathways for those nightmares? Score the likelihood, score the severity, get a risk prioritization that way, collaboratively think about what the solutions look like. The marketing person might have some human-in-the-loop ideas. The data scientist might have some RAG ideas, right? So there's going to be both technical and non-technical resources that we bring to bear on solving the problem. And one thing that I want to highlight is that these teams are fundamentally engaged in problem solving, not procedural compliance. It's not, did you do the things that you have to do? It's, what are the nightmares and how can you figure out together how to avoid them? So fundamentally collaborative problem solving, not compliance. So if you form these ENC teams on an as-needed basis where they're needed, they can be rapidly implemented. They can scale on an as-needed basis. They're outcome-oriented. And that's the view from 50,000 feet of the ethical nightmare challenge solution.
Yeah, I think that's brilliant. I agree. In my experience doing this type of work, collaboration is key. Everyone is wearing a different hat and they're looking at things through a different lens, and you need to get everyone together to share that information. And that can be challenging without
Yeah.
some formality to it. So I'm glad that you acknowledged and have a plan for that part of it. That's honestly, in my work, that's some of the toughest part is you get the folks together. Now what? How do we get everyone on the same
Yeah.
page and
Yeah.
actually turn this into something operationally?
Yeah, I think that the importance, this might be one of the most undervalued parts of this whole thing, is communication, clear communication.
Yes.
Because especially when you're talking about agents, you're talking about these, if you like, digital entities that exist across departments, across roles, right? Like you're bringing if you have an HR AI agent, you've got people from HR involved, you've got legal involved and risk and compliance, and you've got the data scientists, of course. This is just a cross-functional thing. You need to have all these people about cyber. I didn't even mention cyber. So you need all those people. And one of the issues that we have now is that we have attempted collaboration around the Tower of Babel. Just nobody speaks the same language. That's why we require foundational level ENC training. It's just to say, we're going to talk the same language here. We're going to tell you exactly what AI is in plain language. We're going to tell you the kinds of risks or nightmares that are baked in plain language and why they occur. And then we'll give you these 3 questions. It's another thing that I like about nightmares, that term. Everyone knows what a nightmare is or a nightmare scenario. That just sort of makes sense to people. And so it's crucial to get everyone speaking the same language and asking those same 3 questions. I mean, again, if everyone's asking those same 3 questions, that does a ton to facilitate communication. And that method and worksheet that I told you about, that method and worksheet are 99% identical across project level, department level, and enterprise level. So you can have a senior executive who's been on an enterprise level ENC team pick up a project level ENC worksheet. Like these people are working on AI solutions, and she immediately understands what she's looking at because she's seen her own ENC worksheet for the enterprise, and it's basically the same thing as the project level. So she can see, here's the nightmares that I identified, here's how they scored them, here's the resources they introduced. And so now you have not just communication, if you like, from left to right or horizontally across the department, but you also have it vertically because senior executive, board level, junior data scientist, they're all speaking the same language.
Are you finding that the execs and board members recognize a need for this? I think it's obvious to someone on technical staff that this is needed, but it might be a little less obvious to an executive or someone on a board or someone, just anyone who's in a non-technical role.
Yeah. I would have absolutely thought that's the case and agreed with that point 6 months to a year ago. But I think that the conversation on AI agents has reached enough general awareness that, number one, certainly lots of non-tech executives are aware of this thing called AI agents. And number two, it's a bit more obvious to them, not even a bit, I think it's a lot more obvious to them that AI agents are kind of risky. And they're risky because what you're telling a CEO or a COO or a CMO is, yeah, we're going to have these AIs, and we're going to grant them some degree of autonomy, and they're sort of going to go off on their own and do this work. And it doesn't take a technologist to think, is that smart? That
Mhm.
seems good. Can't things go sideways? Like things go off the rails with that, right? It's a lot harder to see that with generative AI, let alone narrow AI. With generative AI, they're like, yeah, I guess we could have some hallucination stuff, okay, and maybe some bad summaries, but we're talking about emails and reports. It doesn't feel like things are really going to go bananas. I think non-technologists can see now in a way that they couldn't pre-AI agents just how easily things can go off the rails. And so I think the interest and frankly demand for AI governance is increasing. Because here's the thing, with AI agents, they're so complicated that if you don't govern them properly, I promise you they're going to go off the rails. It's like impossible for them not to go off the rails. It's like these complicated pieces of machinery. So not properly developed and overseen, things are going to go sideways.
Do you have any thoughts on how to properly articulate the ROI of AI governance? Because I agree with you that it's
Yeah.
more in demand as we see more companies in the news with their nightmares. It becomes more obvious that governance is needed.
Yeah.
But ultimately, at the exec level, they want things that are quantifiable. Are we
Yeah.
there yet? Is there a way to quantify the value of AI governance?
It's hard to say. It's hard. It's always been hard. I mean, it's always hard to prove a negative, right? It's always hard to show that, the absence of something has really benefited us, because you also can't prove that. It's hard to prove that the absence is the result of our efforts. I think though that within a model like ENC teams, where you have these cross-functional teams involved, I think you'll see a couple of things. Number one, you can start tracking speed to market. One of the issues right now is that, well, there's a couple of issues. One is that the way that governance is done now is very sequential. Typically, the developers do their work, and then it gets passed on to the privacy regulation people, then it gets passed on to the cyber people, then it gets passed on to the legal. And so this is, there's different ways of sequencing this, but because it's sequential, it's necessarily taking a long time. That's one issue. This is why quantum computers are so exciting, because it's like it replaces the procedural with the simultaneous. So if we could get the perspectives of those different people on the eyes at the project at the same time talking to each other, we're going to cut down the time to market, because we're going to cut down the time it takes wrapped up in this sort of bureaucratic procedures of checking for all the things. That's one way. That's one kind of ROI. Another kind of ROI, maybe this is a little bit harder to see, but I don't think so, is that right now, when it comes to AI, a standard approach is to have frontline people flag when something is high risk, and then it gets escalated to some kind of risk board. Maybe it's called a responsible AI board, or an AI ethics board, or an AI governance board, or whatever. And that board is usually comprised of fairly senior executives, and that's because they have to have the authority to veto projects, or to say, hey, you got to do this, or you're not getting a green light from us. And this is another bottleneck, because as AI adoption increases, and especially as adoption of agents increases, you're going to get more and more quantity of high-risk cases. So they're going to keep escalated. And now that risk board is a massive bottleneck to innovation, because, again, you're not getting things to market fast enough, because the teams that actually need to be seen aren't getting the help they need. So the long-term solution, anyway, actually I think it's pretty short-term with the ENC, is you need to push additional capabilities to that front line, so that the risk board is only there for exceptions to the rule, whereas most of the high risk stuff is being dealt with those frontline teams because they have the right method for doing so. That's another kind of ROI, less bottleneck. So again, faster to market. The last thing that I'll say is that if you have a product that's deployed and it's making money in one way or another, or it's like doing the thing that you want it to do, and you hadn't, let's say something like an ENC team, and bad stuff hasn't happened, or bad stuff has started to happen, but you were monitoring for it in the right way because your ENC team said, hey, here's how to monitor this, and that thing is continuously in production and creating the value that it is, you can see that the work the ENC did enabled that kind of value creation. So the way that I like to put it is, some people will sort of try to oversell this. in a kind of, I think there's an obviously false way. Ethics makes you more innovative, or, think about ethics. No, it doesn't. There's plenty of unethical ways to innovate. If there were not, then we would have no need to have this conversation. So there's plenty of ways to be unethical and innovative. But the way that I think about it is that it enables the innovation for companies that care about their reputation, their brand, et cetera.
And I
Lawsuits.
think more important, their customers. They care about their
Yes.
customers. I mean,
Yes.
and ultimately their revenue.
Yeah.
That I think of governance as something that allows innovation to be sustainable. Because,
Hmm.
like you said, you can innovate unethically, but if you tick off your customer base, then was it really worth it?
Yeah. I mean, so two things. One, it depends on who you are. There are just some behemoths. They don't care. Like they've got the cash, they've got the revenue. Like they'll just keep going. They can weather this, that, and other scandal. They can weather Instagram causing depression and anxiety among teenage girls. They can weather fines by the EU. Like they'll just keep going. So I don't like it when people are like, "Oh, this is for everyone. This is a bottom line reason for everyone." I'd love for that to be the world, but it's just not the world we live in. We live in a world where sometimes bad people profit quite a bit. In fact, that's one thing to say. The second thing to say is that for everyone else, which I think is frankly 99% of the Fortune 500, 99% of organizations out there, I like to conceive of AI governance as the rope when you're rope climbing. So I rope climb, but when I do it, like there's Alex Honnold, that famous free soloer who climbs insane cliffs and buildings without a rope. I don't do that. I need a rope. Like, I'm not that good. I slip up. I make mistakes. I'm not perfect. I have no interest in going splat. And so I put a rope on when I climb, but the rope doesn't push me up. It doesn't, if you like, help me innovate, so to speak. It doesn't push me up the wall or the cliffside, but it means that if I fall, I'm not going to go splat. So without the rope, I don't go climbing. Having the rope enables my climbing. And I think the same way about AI governance. For any company that genuinely cares about its reputation, its brand, the people it impacts, they need a rope to make sure they don't go splat if they screw up with their innovation. And that's what AI governance is.
I love that analogy. And for my last question, if our listeners can take one action after reading your book or listening to this episode, what
Yeah.
would you like that to be?
I think that again, there's sort of the read neutral one, the read neutral responses. I think that you should get together with other leaders and say, "Hey, do we know what our nightmares are? Have we defined what what really bad looks like? And how do we know that we know how to avoid those things? Do we know how do we know that we have the right things in place to avoid those nightmares?" That's the sort of read neutral thing, work with me or don't work with me. I think you should be able to do that. If you can't say, "Here's what really bad looks like, here's what absolute failure looks like, and we know that we're going to avoid that," that's a bad situation. I think you're in a really bad situation. The more read specific solution, of course, or answer to that is, of course, try out the ENC. You can pilot the ENC. That's another thing. You can't pilot policy. You can pilot this approach because you can say, let's train up an ENC team or two and see how it goes. Yeah, that's the answer.
Thank you. And I want to also show the book for everyone,
Yeah,
please.
yeah, there
Go
it is.
check this out. It was excellent. Thank you for joining us and sharing all of your wisdom.
Yeah,
Appreciate it.
thank you so much for having me. Appreciate it.